welcome to IDDTalks here at AD University. My name is Anastasia Lavrina, and now I'm joined by a distinguished guest from the United Kingdom, James Sharp, former British ambassador and who is now a member of advisory board at the Caspian Policy Center based in Washington, D.C. Ambassador, more welcome.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your time. So it's logical that my first question will be about the situation in the Middle East. Prime Minister Keir Starmer recently stated that Britain will not support any blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, while London simultaneously joined efforts to secure the maritime navigation. So what's your personal understanding of the policy of the United Kingdom towards the war in the Middle East? And the key question, is Britain trying to draw a clear line between deterrence and military escalation with Iran?
Well, overall, the attitude of London towards foreign policy right now is complete chaos. We're actually just today in the middle of sort of a huge row between the Prime Minister and the Foreign Office over the appointment of our previous ambassador to the United States, Peter Mandelson. And it's a question of who said what to whom or didn't say what to whom, when, why, and how. And this is all sort of going on in Parliament today and tomorrow, with potential implications for the Prime Minister, to be fair. So that's really where we are, in a very difficult position in foreign policy terms. And also partly the backdrop to that is that the Foreign Office is having to make a lot of cuts. So the sense, the feeling of the Foreign Office is, well, we've got enough on our plate just internally and within the United Kingdom. But to come to your question, the whole thing about the Middle East again and Iran, US-Iran, has also been politically very sensitive here. The question of does the UK support the US in what it's doing against Iran? And this came up because the US has several air bases on British territory, so we had to give our approval for their use, and that was a bit of a row between the UK and the US as well. So it has, and Trump has sort of voiced, what should we say, some concern about the position and the attitude of our Prime Minister towards that question. So it's a very, very difficult position that we're in now vis-a-vis Iran and the US. The Strait of Hormuz question, I think our government, our Prime Minister has wanted with European allies to show some sort of form of leadership, and how do we then tackle something which is the consequence of which is playing out in terms of damage to all of our economies, to the global economy and the economies of all of our countries, in terms of higher energy prices, higher inflation, etc., and possibly shortages of goods as well, shortage of things like jet fuel and fertilizers. So there's been a very clear sense of wanting to see how we can help tackle that, and particularly with our European allies. And this is actually, again, part of a broader question: how do we cope with the fact that Trump and the US administration are now saying, well, we're not quite sure we want to actually work with NATO. So the Europeans are very much having to sort of find their own way in the world now. There's the whole threat of the withdrawal of American backing for European security. So how do Europeans respond to that? I think it's all part of this question, if you like, and how we approach the whole Strait of Hormuz question. So very much European leadership, and okay, what would a solution look like to navigation through the strait? And I think it's very important to at least acknowledge or to emphasize that no one is talking about how you would open the strait in defiance of the Iranians. If the Iranians say we're still going to attack shipping, we're still going to insist on our rights to do this and that. It's very much how do you actually ensure freedom of navigation and support shipping through the strait when there's a proper peace agreement in place. So I think all the countries involved in this have been very clear about this. They're not looking to somehow take on Iran on this and sort of defy Iran and Iranian threats, but more about how do you then sort of come up with a sustainable longer term solution.
Ambassador, once the war in the Middle East is over, do you expect significant changes in global navigation policy with an attention given to the other projects which probably previously been underestimated, and now I'm talking about the Middle Corridor and the South Caucasus itself. And if so, then what could this mean for support to Ukraine and for the so-called competition between China and the United States?
Yeah, well, certainly we very much hope the US-Israeli war on Iran is over very soon, and also we very much hope, and yeah, this is a fundamental plank of our policy that the navigation through the Strait of Hormuz should go back to what it was before, and we certainly don't support the Iranian claim to be able to impose tolls on shipping or to be able to control shipping through the strait. It should be it's an international waterway, and we don't believe that Iran has any right to actually impose its will or impose charges on shipping going through that. So that would be very much our starting point for any peace deal. Obviously, how we get there is still to be determined, quite frankly, given the sort of difficulties in the negotiations between the US and Iran. But thereafter, I think that what you'll probably find will be a continuing heavy focus on the Gulf, because it's not just about making sure the peace deal sticks, which of course is absolutely crucial, but it's then making sure that navigation can continue. It's about making sure that our relations with the Arab Gulf states are repaired as well, because for them this was not a war they chose, and they're the ones suffering the most damage at the moment, quite frankly. So we will be having discussions. We want to have discussions with them. And certainly our British Prime Minister was out there recently to start those discussions about how we can support them on an ongoing basis, because clearly they've seen the threat that Iran poses to them. So how do you counter that long-term threat, quite frankly? Because a peace deal is a peace deal, but it's only as good as until one of the parties decides it doesn't like the peace deal anymore. So, that we very much, I think, the focus of attention will be on the whole of the Gulf and shipping, relations with the Gulf states, and also shipping through the Gulf. Thereafter, yes, as you say, we've still got a war going on in Ukraine. It still has to be tackled. Ukraine still needs to be supported. There still needs to be a peace deal on that as well. So that will then be, I think, a big focus of attention. More strategically, there's a bigger question of what's the future relationship with China going to look like, of course, which is still to be worked out. And I think that as every country is finding it, there's a lot of positives and then some negatives in the relationship, and how you actually balance that is always one of the difficult tricks of foreign policy. Then yes, of course, you then raise the regional aspects of British foreign policy as relates to the South Caucasus. And I think that we haven't really taken a leading role on that in the recent past. Certainly there was a C5, the Central Asian 5+1, plus the British Foreign Minister meeting in London a month or two ago, and that led to sort of some useful little agreements. I think I wouldn't say that was strategic agreements or strategic change of direction, but it was more kind of a signal of some intent to do a bit more with the region. And I think that what I would still like to see happening is, to say first of all, it's good that the British Foreign Office has now taken a more regional approach, because one of my criticisms has always been that they're good at bilateral relations, but not so good at regional approaches. So it's good that they've taken a regional approach towards Central Asia. I'm just a bit disappointed they didn't actually expand that and think more about the sort of broader connectivity question of the Middle Corridor from Central Asia across the Caspian through Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey, the whole Middle Corridor question. Because we've seen the Central Asians, of course, expand their C5 to a C6 to include Azerbaijan to recognise that connectivity question. So I think that's the next step that the UK needs to think about. Look at it, Azerbaijan in that broader context. And the other, of course, somewhat immediate question of the Armenian elections, which take place on June the 7th. And before that, there's a European Political Community Summit in Armenia, which I'm sure the British Prime Minister will hope to attend. So that will be crucial. That's the support that the Europeans can give to the electoral process in Armenia, and hopefully the right person will win, and we can then have the constitutional referendum that will go well, and then we can sign the peace deal with Azerbaijan, and then that will then, I think, give huge opportunities for everyone in the whole South Caucasus region to start developing more of a regional policy.
Ambassador, that's very interesting. You partially answered my next question about EU-Armenia relations. With the upcoming first ever EU-Armenia summit to take place later in May, what interests the European Union in the region of the South Caucasus, how it can affect the policy of Yerevan towards the normalization and peace process with Azerbaijan? Might it actually affect the policy of Prime Minister, and how exactly it can also contribute to the upcoming elections in Armenia, which will take place in summer?
I think that the European mission, I think you need to kind of look at that in a slightly different context. There's this monitoring mission, the border mission, which Armenia has agreed to sort of get rid of once the peace deal is signed as part of the agreement. But I think there's still that sense that, given that Pashinyan and the Armenian government have actually said that they want to get closer to Europe and maybe think about membership of the European Union, then the European Union, of course, is going to respond to that by wanting to provide some sort of support for that process, that wider consolidation process. And what does Armenia need to do to get closer to Europe? So I think that's more related to that question rather than Azerbaijan, Armenia. So I don't think it's really an issue that the Azerbaijan government should worry about, quite frankly. I think I've been a critic of the European Union for some time as well, and really I think that they have made a number of missteps in the South Caucasus, quite frankly. And yes, I mean, Trump stepped in, got the summit in last August in Washington, got agreement to the trip, which hopefully work is taking place on that, and the modalities of that, and construction. But the European Union, have a reasonably strong role it should be playing in the region, because this is the sort of thing that is tailor-made for what the EU does. It does economic development, it does regional connectivity, and so this is exactly looking at how do you then of a regional approach towards Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, the whole concept of the South Caucasus, and South Caucasus as both a unit in itself, but also part of that wider connectivity question as well. So I think this provides opportunities for Europe, the European Union. They do need to get over the difficulties in their relationship with Georgia, because I think again they've taken some wrong steps in just focusing solely on one aspect of the relationship, and they sort of painted themselves into a corner where Georgia is just bad, the Georgian regime is bad, and we all understand the issues of the sort of democracy and human rights and all of that. But I think the European Union needs to sort of reconsider its process and its policy towards Georgia, because at the moment they are achieving no results whatsoever. And effectively ruling themselves out of that whole question about how do you promote regional cooperation and development. And I just think they just need to step back from that kind of sense of, they've done, Georgian regime have done what we didn't want them to do, and it's outrageous, and they should do what we want. And it's just like, yeah, but okay, but this is a sovereign country, and this is an elected government, and yes, you don't like it, and we understand that, but you just need to sort of look at the broader context of your policies and how you can actually bring more stability, more development to the South Caucasus.
Ambassador, to what you have just said, recently Nikol Pashinyan, Prime Minister of Armenia, acknowledged that without open economic links with Azerbaijan, Armenia would have suffered far more from the economic fallout of the Middle East crisis. Does this underline that regional connectivity is no longer theoretical, but an urgent economic necessity for the region and for Armenia itself? And based to what you said about Georgia, should we expect more coordinative, let's say, business relations, economic partnership between three countries in the South Caucasus, and how Europe may benefit from this partnership?
Absolutely. I mean, that's really always been my sense. These three countries, they all have their own interests, they all have their own, economic advantages. But the fact is, they're all very small countries, and they're not particularly close to big markets. So it just makes absolute sense for them to cooperate more. It always has done. You create a bigger market, you create economies of scale. You just have export opportunities. You have everything. I mean, that's the way economics works. Basically, so the bigger the block, the bigger the grouping, the more opportunities you have. So that's always been my sense is, how do you then realize peace and stability in the South Caucasus, which then sort of sets the ground for further development by being supported by not just the EU but other countries as well. I think Turkey can play an important role there because it's an economic superpower, quite frankly, in regional terms. And I think the Americans again can add to what they're doing with TRIP to then support the wider development of the region. But and that just seems to me the obvious solution. As I said, I just kind of hope that both the countries themselves can do the right thing, but also the outside powers can actually do the right things to support peace and development in the region rather than try to undermine it. And obviously, I'm talking about Russia in particular, which has been not one might say not necessarily a force for good in the region for quite some time. So. How you deal with that as well. So I think I've always been optimistic that things would work out in the end, and I still am. But there are still some steps to be sorted out. But I do think that with the right approach by the outside powers in particular, and with the right steps by the actual countries themselves of the region, then we'll get there.
Ambassador, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining IDDTalks.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you very much.